The focus of 2 Timothy chapter 2 is primarily divided into two parts. One is for Peter to give a history lesson of sorts to show how God has always punished those who have sinned against Him, and that those who have lived worldly and who have lived unrighteous lives on the earth would eventually meet their reward in a negative sense, their just deserved punishment at some point in their future. It might not come immediately after their sin, but it would come eventually because of their sin. The second part of the chapter, which really it's not divided into two parts, but it flows very seamlessly from one to the other, involves the present era of Peter's day when he was writing this letter, and the many false teachers who had started to lead people astray, and the consequences that those Christians and those false teachers were facing if they went through with their abandoning of Christ. It's written all in the midst of persecution, which was of course the theme of the first letter and here of the second letter as well, and of the short-sightedness that sometimes takes over those who are being persecuted. They tend to lose sight of the greater perspective that heaven is beyond the horizon, and they look to just getting through the world and just trying to endure the world, when really they ought to be looking to turn to Christ and put their focus on Him, and therefore the world's effects and attacks on them will not be as effective. But if we take our eyes off Christ and we start focusing on the problems and the difficulties that we're enduring, then the temptation is to just do whatever we need to do to ease the pain and to take away the problem that is affecting us, when that should never be the goal of the Christian. It should be to take the punishment and press toward the mark of heaven itself. These false teachers were trying to teach Christians that it's all about this world, it's about this life, it's about living, when it really is about serving. They were saying it's about living, and it's about enduring this life the best way possible. And to do that, they were saying we need to rise up against our government, we need to rebel against the leaders who are oppressing us so violently. And Peter's response to that is, you're Christians. You don't belong to this world anymore. That was the old life that you lived. That was the old way you would have handled things. But now you have been transformed by Christ to a new life. You need to turn to Christ for your problem solutions, and not to violence, and not to the lack of respect for authority. And so both of those issues are addressed in 2 Timothy chapter 2, which begins with a history lesson. And it begins right where chapter 1 left off, where Peter at the end of 2 Peter 1 was speaking of inspiration, which of course he himself was writing by. And then he says, but there are false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false prophets among you. He had ended chapter 1 by saying, in the Old Testament times, the old prophets of God spoke by inspiration of God, as we do today. And he says, but also in those days, when the Old Testament writers were speaking by inspiration, there were, along with them, false preachers, false prophets, who claimed inspiration but had none, who claimed authority but held none. And so it is today as well. As I, Peter says, am preaching and writing to you by inspiration, there's at the same time those false teachers that are among you who are claiming inspiration when they have none. False prophets among you, who privately shall bring in damnable heresies, false teachings that will condemn a soul, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. They will turn against Christ, the very Christ who redeemed them, bought them from Satan's grasp, and turn back to Satan without even saying so, without even perhaps wanting to go back to Satan. They just don't want to follow Christ, and thus they're left with that only option. And they will bring upon themselves swift destruction. Not swift necessarily how quickly will it happen, but swift how suddenly will it come upon them whenever it happens. Verse 2, and many shall follow their pernicious, their ways of ruin, their ways that lead only to destruction, their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. While they're telling you lies, they are running down truth tellers. While they are propping up their false teachings, they are running down the truth. And many will follow them because it's an easier message. It's one that satisfies the here and now. It's one that satisfies the primal urge to exist in the moment and not live for the future. And so many will follow them. Verse 3, and through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you. Through covetousness, that's what you'll have. They'll lead you to covet. They'll show you attractive things to entice you with feigned words, with words of deceit, and they will make merchandise of you. They will buy you and use you for their own gain, their own unsatisfactory purposes. Whose judgment now of a long time lingers not, and their condemnation slumbers not. God will be avenged. It may take a while, but He hasn't forgotten. God will get His revenge. It may not be as soon as you think it should be, or as soon as you think it will be, but it will come. It is not slumbering. Verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, he begins a history lesson. First with the angels. Before the beginning, if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them to chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. And then he'll continue with, and also spared not Noah's day, and also spared not Sodom and Gomorrah. If he won't spare them, he won't spare these false teachers or those with them as well. But he begins the history lesson with the angels. God did not spare the angels that sinned, but rather cast them down to hell, outer darkness, deliver them into the chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. The first of two specific references to judgment. When judgment comes, whenever it comes, it will come swiftly. It will come suddenly. It will come so quickly whenever it comes that there'll be no last minute chance to get right. You be right now. Be ready always, so that when it does come, you're prepared. But these angels, God gave the option. You can choose to serve me or choose not to serve me. Some angels, Satan chief among them, chose not to serve. Man, however, is not given a choice to serve. Man is given a command to serve. Satan tempts man to break the commands of God. And thus, when we do, we sin as a result of that temptation. But the angels were told, you choose to serve or not to serve. Those that chose not to serve had to, by God's nature, be expelled from His presence. His presence is pure and holy. He cannot have unholiness and unrighteousness in His presence. And so He delivered them to chains of darkness, reserved until they can be brought up to be judged by Christ Himself, the judge over angels and men. Hebrews 1 and 2. Verse 5. History lesson continues. He spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, sometimes translated Noah and the other seven, which makes him the eighth person. Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. He spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Once again, God's judgment was coming. God's judgment came. It came upon the angels, and it'll be finally delivered and administered at the judgment day. But punishment in that sense came. Punishment came to the world who had sinned in the days of Noah, where all around him was wickedness. And the only ones who ever listened to Noah were his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. No one else turned to God. They had opportunity. In the meantime, while Noah was building the ark and he was preaching, man had opportunity to enter the ark, but man chose not to. And then judgment came suddenly. Judgment came unexpectedly. The flood came quickly. It didn't come quickly in terms of from point A to point B. It was 120 years or so. But when that time came for the flood to come, it all came suddenly. And it was too late to change. Once again, God's judgment was sure. Again, verse 6, another history lesson. And turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow. That wicked city where men committed all sorts of wicked physical sins. He said, or Peter says here, once again, God's judgment was sure and swift. He brought down the cities with an overthrow and made them an ensample. He made them an image to look to see, in this case, as a warning, as a message to those that would come after. If you sin, here's what happens. Judgment comes upon you. Destruction comes upon you. Making them an ensample unto those that after should live ungodly. You live ungodly like they did, like all others do. If you live an ungodly life in whatever way you want to live ungodly, look at what happened to these ungodly cities. They were destroyed, overthrown. Verse 7. He delivered just Lot, delivered just, not just like an only, but just as in he was fair, he was righteous. Lot was doing right. He was a just man. Delivered just Lot, who was vexed, the Bible says. The word means worn down and tired. He was worn down and tired with the filthy manner of life of the wicked. He lived among so many wicked people, and it wore him down. But it did not wear him down to the point of giving up. It just wore him down to the point of exhaustion in doing right. He continues, verse 8, "For that righteous man dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds." The longer he lived in that wickedness, the more he was worn down by it, to the point where he would have died doing right. It would have just worn him down to death. He had two options. He could have been worn down and defeated, or he could have been worn down and died. He would have been worn down and died, rather than worn down and defeated. Because worn down and defeated means he gives up and goes into the sin itself, and makes the easier life, lives the more comfortable life among those who are also sinful. But he was worn down and ready to die. Instead, verse 9, "The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation." How does he do that? Well, how did he do it for Lot? He destroyed the sin around him. How did he deliver Noah from the temptation around him? He destroyed the sin around him. So it is with us today. God will destroy the sin around us at the final judgment day. But he continues, "The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment, to be punished." Punished eternally, everlasting. He uses the word unjust. Contrast that with Lot from the previous two verses, who was a just man, who was worn down and ready to die doing right, though no one else was. Instead, God had mercy on Lot, and it was the wicked who died, and Lot who lived. And so it is with us. God knows how to deliver all of us as well. But chiefly them that walk after the flesh of this present era, this present age, Peter says, after the flesh, in the lust of uncleanness, that is moral bankruptcy, and despise government. That's their specific sin that they're committing and encouraging others to commit. Presumptuous are they, self-willed. That is, they're too obsessed with themselves. They don't want to serve. They're so presumptuous. It's all about them. Self-willed. They're not afraid to speak evil of dignities, that is, of authorities, which has been given to us by God. Which means in speaking evil against their king, or their Caesar, or the governors, they're speaking evil against the God who by his providential hand put them in power. It's one thing to use a democratic process and to try to peacefully leave a corrupted or oppressive government, and then if they attack you, defend yourself. It's a very different thing to stir up an uprising, an insurrection, to provoke with sinfulness, sinful behavior, a rebellion against the authority and the government God gave you. These kinds of Christians, and these are Christians, he'll say later, are trying to tell their brethren that this world is what matters. And as we're suffering in this world, our response should be violence. We should turn against our enemies. We should turn and attack the government that is oppressing us. Whereas angels, verse 11, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing accusation against them before the Lord, against the governments. The governments are wicked. The governments are evil. The governments are oppressive. Even the greater in terms of their power, he says, greater in power and might, they don't bring accusation against them. Who are we to do so? But these, verse 12, as natural brute beasts, he says of these false teachers, like animals, they made to be taken and destroyed. They speak evil of the things that they understand not. They have no concept of the fact that God gives governments. They shall utterly perish in their own corruption. As they teach false doctrine, they'll be destroyed with the false doctrine at judgment. They shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. They're the kinds of people who would commit sin in broad daylight. Whereas typically we associate sin with clandestine activity, with nighttime activity, with darkened corridors and darkened alleyways. But these men are so brazen in their sinfulness, they have no qualm, no shame about sinning in the open. They'll riot in the daytime. Spots they are, and blemishes. Their once sin covered with the blood of Christ's soul and washed away has now been respotted, reblemished. Sporting themselves with their own deceivings while they feast with you. While they have fellowship with you, they whisper evil lies in your ears, and presently you're letting them, Peter says. Reject them, turn away from them. They're feasting with you, and they're feasting off of you as well. Verse 14, they have eyes full of adultery. They see the world as a playground for their wickedness because they can't see past the world. He says, verse 14 again, continuing, having eyes full of adultery and cannot cease from sin. They can't stop sinning. Not that they won't, not that they don't know how, but they choose not to. They just can't stop sinning. Beguiling, lying to unstable souls. A heart they have exercised with covetous practices, cursed children. That's what Peter says of them. They are sons of Satan. They are children of destruction. But yet, they were Christians at one time. Faithful Christians at least at one time. Now they've turned away from Christ. They have forsaken the right way and are gone astray, following the way of Balaam. They are like that old prophet from Numbers 22, the son of Bozer, who loved wages of unrighteousness, who took what God had given him and used it for his own selfish purposes. That's these false teachers. Taken what God has given them, twisted it, and used it for their own purposes because they are obsessed with living comfortably in this world and not getting to the next. As Balaam was rebuked for his iniquity, the dumb mule speaking with man's voice forbade the madness of the prophet, the insanity of the prophet. Not the insanity of the spectacle of a mule, a donkey speaking to man. No, that's just a miracle of God. The insanity was this prophet using what God had given him for his own purposes, without any respect to the fact that eternity is waiting on him. That's these false teachers. It's insane what they're doing. Verse 17. These false teachers, these are wells without water. They look good till you get up close, then they're profitless. They are clouds carried with a tempest. They are clouds that seem to bring forth good showers, but when they come over your head, they're empty and they float on by. To whom the midst of darkness is reserved forever. The only thing they bring is a dark cloud over your head that don't ever produce the water, the rain that you need. They just produce the gloom, but no rain. Verse 18. For when they speak great swelling words of vanity, they appeal to your sense of self. They appeal to your arrogance. They appeal to you as a physical, worldly person. They allure through the lusts of the flesh, through much wantonness, that is, through the great lack of morality. They're lacking in that. Those that were clean escaped from them who live in error. Verse 19, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are servants of corruption. They say we can find freedom from our oppressive government, but really all they're promising you is a different kind of slavery. You might rise up against your government, you might overthrow your government, but if you do so in a sinful manner, you'll be a brand new kind of slave to a much worse oppressor, Satan, the great dictator. While they promise freedom, they themselves are servants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same he is brought in bondage. Again, these are Christians who are going back to and desiring others to follow them to sinful bondage. For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. It's worse for them afterward than it is presently. Now you can apply that in two ways, the way Peter does, or you can also broaden it. You could broaden it by saying it will be worse for them later in hell than it is now while they're being persecuted as Christians. It would be better to be persecuted now and endure later, receive the blessings of heaven later. That's his purpose of 1 Peter. But the way he applies it here is in verse 21. It had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness. It had been better. They do know the way of righteousness. It would be better for them not to have known the way of righteousness, then after they have known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. These are Christians. Don't say a Christian can't fall away. That's what Peter's talking about here. These false teachers who were once faithful Christians, have now gone away from the faith. And it's better for them, it would have been better if they had never known anything. That now that they know what they've left behind, they will have all of eternity in hellfire if they don't repent, to think about what they left behind when they abandoned Christ. They turned from the holy commandment delivered to them, and it has happened to them according to the true proverb, that old saying, two of them. The dog is turned to its own vomit again, the sow washed to its wallowing in the mire. He uses two animals that are in this culture, in this region, despised animals. Undomesticated dogs in that era were treated like we treat coyotes. They were treated as vermin, overgrown vermin. They were scavengers. They were nasty, filthy animals. And they would vomit, and they would go back and eat their own vomit. That disgusting depiction is the way God, Christ, looks at Christians who go back to the world. He says pig, sow. For every Jew, that has great significance. It's the unclean animal of all unclean animals. The uncleanness, the poster child of unclean animals, the sow. And it goes back after it's been washed to wallowing in the mire. That disgusting image. You work hard, you sacrifice your time and energy to wash this animal, and it goes back itself voluntarily to be filthy again. Don't go back to the sickness and eat it again and be consumed by it. Don't go back to the dirt and the muck and the mud of sinfulness and be consumed by it again. Most certainly don't say it can't happen. That kind of arrogance and pride leads it to happen. 1 John 1 and 2. That's 2 Peter chapter 2. It's basically the bridge between chapter 1 and chapter 3. This section of chapter 2 where he talks about the history lesson and the reality of the present moment, that these false teachers are, as false teachers did in the past, trying to lead you astray, they will be punished at the coming of Christ. At the same time, those false teachers are saying, what coming of Christ? There's no coming of Christ. We've been waiting this long, He must not be coming. And that's the greatest lie of all. If they can get you to believe that lie, it makes it 1,000 times easier to get you to follow all sorts of sinfulness. If Christ really isn't coming, then it really is all about this world and how I live in this world and living comfortably in this world. But if He is coming, and as Peter will argue in chapter 3, He is coming, then I need to get right. I need to live right so that when He does come, suddenly and unexpectedly, I will be prepared. That's 2 Peter chapter 3, the last chapter of this book, which we'll consider this time next week. Until then, thank you so much.